Senator Chris Coons, many thanks for joining DW here at the Munich Security Conference. Now, you're the senator from Joe Biden's home state of Delaware. You succeeded him there. Also, you're a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so you're really plugged into security, global security issues. Maybe the most impactful speech here today at the Munich Security Conference was from Wang Yi, from China's top diplomat. And he didn't really pull any punches in a speech that was very critical of the United States, talking about trying to create a Cold War mentality in the world, trying to divide the world in two. What's your response to that?
Well, I'd like to argue that the most impactful speech of the day was delivered by Vice President Kamala Harris, who was reminding us that she gave a speech on this exact stage a year ago, cautioning the world about what was about to happen, and then several days, in fact, did. A brutal expansion by Russia of its 8-year-old invasion and occupation of Ukrainian territory. Yes, the speech by a top diplomat from China did basically suggest the United States is responsible for all bad things in the world. They are supposedly undergoing a charm offensive at the moment. If that's their idea of a charm offensive, I think it's more offensive than charming. And frankly, I disagree with his characterization of the spy balloon that was sent over the United States by China as merely a meteorological instrument. That's less important than the core message of this conference, which is the unity of NATO, the unity of dozens of other countries around the world in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine, the insistence on accountability, the broad spectrum support for Ukraine's brave resistance to Russia's aggression, and the determination to expand NATO to include Finland and Sweden. Many of the meetings I've been in today have been focused on those topics. There is the largest delegation from the American Congress that has ever attended this conference, and a key part of why there are so many of us here, Democrats and Republicans, is to reassure our European partners and allies of the durability of American support for this vital work in Ukraine.
So I want to get more to that topic of the war in Ukraine in a moment. I just want to stay with the US-China relationship for a moment, because the balloon obviously kind of played out as a certain kind of drama. The Chinese accusing the United States of being hysterical in its reaction. The United States, of course, rejecting that. But taking one step back from it, there are some analysts who are saying that this flags up concerns about how able the US and China are to deal with unexpected crises when they come along, that there simply aren't those kinds of hotlines that were really depended on during the 20th century Cold War. How concerned are you about that?
I'm very concerned. A number of my colleagues questioned whether Secretary Blinken should be trying to meet with senior Chinese diplomats. I think he needs to, he should, and we need those hotlines, as you described them. Even at the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, where we had thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles on hair trigger to attack each other, our military, our diplomatic, our senior elected leaders of both the United States and the Soviet Union had means of communicating to avoid a crisis, or in a crisis, to understand each what the other meant. That America's most senior military leader tried to reach out to China, to his counterpart, when we were trying to understand what was going on with this balloon, and the call was refused, was a bad sign. We need more Chinese willingness to meet us halfway. There are still lots of issues facing our world, whether it's climate change, the pandemic that is just barely behind us, or the next pandemic, or how we're going to sustainably develop around the world, where we need to cooperate. There's obviously other areas where we are competitors. My hope is that by having more regular dialogue, we can avoid unintentional conflict.
I just want to stay on this issue of hotlines for a moment, because I think this will alarm a lot of people watching this. The fact that there simply isn't this kind of connection. I mean, the United States said that just before Christmas, there was very nearly a collision in the South China Sea between a US aircraft and a Chinese fighter. They came within 6 meters of each other, apparently. What happens in a scenario when they do actually collide, and where maybe members of the respective air forces are killed?
Well, that's the sort of thing we unfortunately have experience with from the Cold War. That's part of why we had those deconfliction hotlines, and that's why we need to have them again. I'll remind you, what is the United States doing in the South China Sea? freedom of navigation or freedom of aviation exercises, along with European and Indo-Pacific partners and allies, in order to reinforce the rules-based international order, which bluntly China has violated by asserting control over a much broader area of the South China Sea than it is entitled to, by militarizing islands that are not Chinese territory. This has been a pattern now over many years of aggressive conduct by pilots in the air, by the Chinese Coast Guard in sea lanes, and we need a deconfliction avenue to avoid a needless conflict here.
But what is the U.S. doing to achieve this? Because we spoke to a Chinese member of the Chinese delegation here this weekend as well, a former member, a senior member of the PLA. He said that he believed that kind of hotline is the sort of thing that you will only really get once you approach equilibrium between the two militaries. It's going to take some time, in his view. The implication being that we face several years of destabilized, very, very low stability. So what is the U.S. doing to try to get the Chinese on board for this kind of finding these guardrails that Joe Biden talks about?
I don't know what more we can be doing than extending our hand, offering to meet, offering those conversations. Just think about how ridiculous that statement is by the PLA official. The South China Sea has been actively and aggressively militarized by the Chinese. It's their warplanes that are buzzing our observation planes. It's their Coast Guard that is attacking Philippine or Vietnamese or American ships or commercial vessels. So I don't think it's reasonable to say, what more is the United States going to do? We're doing what we should do. We're extending a hand or a phone line to the Chinese, and for them to say, we won't talk to them for years until we've achieved military parity, doesn't recognize the reality on the ground or in the air or on the seas.
Now, we heard from Wang Yi that China is going to be putting forward peace proposals soon. What have you heard about these peace proposals? What confidence do you have, given China's implicit support for Russia, that is going to be something that the U.S. And his partners will be willing to give serious consideration?
China has long made a core principle of its foreign policy respect for territorial sovereignty. So if they are to return to that principle by clearly calling out Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and its illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory, that would be great. That would be welcome. Just a few days before Putin launched a broad-spectrum invasion of the majority of Ukrainian territory, building on 8 years of hostile action in Crimea and the Donbass, President Xi and President Putin met and talked about a friendship without limits. There have to be limits. The key limit should be that core principle of Chinese foreign policy, which is respecting the sovereignty of other countries and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. I can't think of a clearer example in recent years than Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of the violation of those core principles. So if there's a peace plan forthcoming, I hope it will be rooted in the restoration of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty.
Now, you've been stressing U.S. support for Ukraine, the fact that it's a huge delegation here, unity within NATO towards the Ukraine conflict. Tony Blinken also was gushing with praise for the Germans earlier in his event. And yet there have been some tensions within the West about things like the speed of how quickly to provide certain weapons, particularly this recent saga about providing tanks. Now you were pretty close to those negotiations. Looking back on that, what can you tell us? I mean, it feels like it's kind of done and dusted, but during those negotiations, it got pretty tense about what kind of, with Germany facing a lot of accusations of indecisiveness, of dithering over this, and then finally making the demand that the U.S. put some skin in the game with some Abrams tanks. Tell me, how did this come about, and how much arm twisting was involved in all that?
Look, one of the core principles of how we have proceeded from a year ago, from this conference a year ago, is consultation. Some have suggested that the United States in its conduct of foreign policy historically has not always been as consultative and respectful of the views and priorities of its NATO partners. This is an instance where we have proactively shared intelligence, both with our allies and publicly. We have waited until we have reached consensus amongst our NATO allies and our other partners, and then moved forward with further delivery of badly needed military hardware into Ukraine. President Zelensky, I know, has publicly and privately expressed frustration with how long sometimes that consultative process has required. But I have to compliment Chancellor Scholz for having led a dramatic change in German economic, military, and foreign policy, a policy that was decades old. And I respect the fact that given Germany's history, particularly in Eastern Europe, there was hesitation to send battle tanks into Ukraine without clarity that the United States, as well as other partners, would be moving in that same direction. What we're focused on now, and came up in a number of meetings here today, is what is the end state? How do we hope to be able to guarantee Ukrainian security and to allow Ukraine, if and when there is a ceasefire and then hopefully some negotiation for peace, to deter future Russian resumption of aggression? That's going to require providing advanced conventional weapons, NATO interoperability, and some fairly sophisticated weaponry. It's been a long road to get us to this point, but it's been the right road. Consultation between NATO allies has produced sustained, consistent, uniform support for Ukraine.
Now you mentioned endgame. I mean, one potential kind of hurdle towards an endgame would be the question of whether Ukraine, if it gets onto a kind of a roll of military successes in the next few months, whether it then attempts to retake Crimea. Tony Blinken was asked about that today. He stuck to this line that it's really, the US will support Ukraine in making these decisions, but ultimately the decision over Crimea is one that really does impact the whole of Western security, because it's seen as a potential red line for Putin to potentially start throwing around nuclear weapons. What is your view on Crimea, whether Ukraine should go ahead and retake it?
I think it's reckless and irresponsible for us to allow a nuclear-armed state to use that threat over and over, to violate international law, to violate its own sovereign commitments, and to badger, belittle, or bully the rest of the world into allowing Russian aggression to go unchecked. In 1994, Ukraine gave up a massive nuclear arsenal in exchange for a written guarantee from Russia, as well as the UK and United States, that we would respect the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. That was 1991 maps that Russia signed on the dotted line. So Putin can say explicitly or implicitly Crimea is a red line. I hope the world will hold him accountable for having signed on the dotted line about Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. I think Ukraine gets to decide at what point they've made enough progress towards restoring their territorial sovereignty, and we heard from the foreign minister earlier today that that means the full restoration of territorial sovereignty to the lines of 1991. We have to find effective ways to deter Putin from crossing the one line that should not be crossed, the use of nuclear weapons. And my hope is that China, as well as other countries like India and South Africa that are still standing on the sidelines of this conflict, have made clear and will continue to make clear that they will not support Putin and that there will be consequences for the misuse of nuclear weapons to bully Ukraine into giving up parts of its territory.
Just before we approach the end of this, I want to ask you about the issue of stamina is really one that people have been talking about.
You mean my stamina because it's been a long day?
Putin seems to be, his only game seems to be to try and play for time. Obviously, a quick victory has not been possible. There are questions about whether Western free democratic societies can sustain the level of support. People are looking at the United States, it's approaching election season. The Republican Party is not wholly united on this. The Biden administration, parts of Congress are sending the right signals, but how far can Europe really count on the United States remaining politically stable itself sufficiently to see this through?
You're absolutely right that Putin's playbook is grinding aggression. It's how he succeeded in 2 wars in Chechnya. It's how he succeeded in a brutal civil war in Syria. by grinding down resistance through really World War I or even medieval levels of violence. We cannot allow that to succeed in Ukraine. You heard here on the stage today from our Vice President, but you also heard it in statements both public and private from Republican and Democratic members of the House and Senate. An important part of why both Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell were here was to deliver that message about American persistence, American support for Ukraine, and our determination to provide the resources Ukraine will need. In December, we appropriated another $45 billion to allow our administration to provide the humanitarian, the economic, and the military support that Ukraine needs and deserves. I am confident we will continue and stay the course.
So looking ahead, how does this war end?
It ends when Ukraine wins. It ends when an expanded NATO and partners and supporters from around the world insist on the restoration of territorial sovereignty, and when Ukraine has breakout successes on the battlefield later this spring. And then, God willing, a negotiated resolution that leads to accountability for those who've committed war crimes and the restoration of peace in Europe.
Chris Coons, thanks for speaking to DW.
Thank you, Richard.